This video is going to cover the topic of decimal basics. Be sure the date and topic are at the top of your page. The essential question for this video is, how do we order, compare, and round decimals? And we've been working with fractions, but now we're going to turn our attention to something very similar and related, and that is decimals. And like fractions, decimals are another way to indicate a fractional value. And we see this as numbers written to the right of a decimal point. When we read decimals, we know that there are different place values that correspond to different fractional amounts. So for example, 0.234, we can label each of these numbers as a different place value. So the 2 is in the tenths place, the 3 is in the hundredths place, and the 4 is for thousands, which is kind of like saying 2 tenths, 3 hundredths, and 4 thousandths, right? It's related to our fractions. And this is a helpful reminder as we compare and order decimals. Let's look at these two values, 94 hundredths and 97 hundredths. When we compare these, which one is larger? If we think about money, it's fairly obvious. We know that 97 cents would be more than 94 cents. But what I like to do in general when I'm thinking of decimals is line them up and check the place value. And by that I mean line them vertically with the decimal points on top of one another. And then I can check each place value to see which one is larger. So in this column, they both have 0 ones. That doesn't help. Here, they both have 9 tenths, the same. But in this column, I can see that they have a difference, right? This one has a 4 and this one has a 7. So this has 4 hundredths and this one has 7 hundredths, right? So that's a difference here. And I know that 7 hundredths is bigger than 4 hundredths. So if this is larger, then this whole number is larger. I'm actually going to go back up here and kind of make a little symbol here to show that that side is the larger of the two. So here's another one. Here's two decimals, and I want to see which of these two is larger than the other. So again, I'm just going to do what I've done before and line up my decimal points. So they're lined up with the decimal points, one on top of one another. And I can look at each column and say, well, in the ones place, those are the same. That doesn't help. In the tenths place, those are the same. That doesn't help. But in this column here, they are different, right? So my 8 and my 9, those are the two things I'm comparing. The 9 is obviously larger, so that means this whole number is larger. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark it that way, right? That means it is larger. A lot of times, students think that the longer the number is, the larger it is, but that is not always the case. So just kind of keep that in mind. So here's one more for you to try. So take a moment on your own and figure out which of these is larger. Pause the video, use a strategy that works for you, and then indicate which of these two numbers has the larger value. How'd you do? Did you notice that in the hundredths column, this 7 was larger than the 4? So that means that whole entire number is larger than the second. Sometimes we are asked to order our decimals, and so knowing how to identify which is larger is important to be able to complete that skill. So I'll give you a list of some decimal values and we'll put those in order. So I have a list here of 5 different decimal values that we're going to put in order. And again, I like to kind of line things up vertically with the decimals all aligned. That helps me see things a little more clearly. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And so I have these all lined up, and I'm going to look, I think I'll just start with looking for the largest. So I'm going to start on the left. I'm going to start in this column here. And I can see that that's a 0. That's not very big. I have 2 3s, and then the others are 0. So I need to compare these 2 3s first. I know that they're going to be 2 of my largest. So I'm going to look in the next column and say, oh, well, this 7 is bigger than this 6. This one is, I'll mark this as number 1. This one is largest because 7 is bigger than 6. And since there weren't any others that had 3 in the ones place, I know this is automatically my second largest, right? So those 2 are taken care of. And then I'm going to continue looking. I don't need to look at this one anymore or this one, right? Those are already done. So I'm going to continue looking, and in my column here again, I'm going to just compare this 3, this 7, and this 3. And since this 7 is the largest, that means that's my next biggest number. From there, right, I'm done with that one. From there, I know these two were tied in the tenths place. They had the same number of tenths. This in my hundredths place is a 6 compared to a 7 down here, and 7 is larger than 6. So this one must be next. And that one's done, which means this last one here is my smallest number. I just kind of went through from left to right to figure that out. So normally when we do something like this, we end up needing to write these in order from least to greatest. So I'm going to start with number 5, go number 2, 4, 3, 2, 1, and so on. And of course, at some point you'll probably be so comfortable that you won't need to line it up and make sure you check meticulously from left to right, but it's a good strategy to make sure that you don't miss anything and make sure it all goes in the right order. So go ahead and take a moment to reorder these. Right now they are not in order from least to greatest, but go ahead and try that on your own. Pause the video, give it a whirl, and see how you did. How'd you do? Hopefully you found them to be in the same order that you see here on my page. The last thing we want to make sure we are confident and comfortable with when we talk about our decimal basics is rounding decimals. When we talk about decimals, there are always a bunch of students who have a little bit of a rhyme or a reminder that they learned in 5th grade that says if it is 4 or less, let it rest. If it's 5 or more, let it soar. And that's kind of a reminder to them about their rounding rules. But I just want to make sure we kind of know mathematically why that is the case so we can use it correctly. So let's say we have the number 3 2/10 and we want to round it to the nearest whole number. The first thing we have to do is realize what the whole number means. And that means we're trying to round it to just have one number here, and we don't want anything in the tenths place. But to do that, we have to look to the tenths place to decide. And if you're using your rhyme, then you're thinking, oh, well, that's less than 4, right? 2 is less than 4. So I'm going to let it rest, meaning it would just be plain old 3, right? But I kind of had to decide, was it 3 or was it 4? So let's look at the math behind it. So if I have a number line and I'm looking to put 3.2 on my number line, it would be somewhere between 3 and 4. It would actually be right here. 3 2/10 would be right here. And so when I look at the placement of my number, what I'm asking myself is it closer to 3 or is it closer to 4? And obviously, right, this is clearly much closer to 3 than it is to 4, right? This is much shorter here. So that's why we round it to 3. So we can do the same thing here. Let's say we want to round the number 11.8. And again, we need to know what we want to round to. We want to round to the nearest whole number, which means we're trying to round so that we look to our decimal place and we decide if we are going to use that decimal to round up or to leave it at just 11. So here's 11 and 12 on my number line. 11.8 would be right here. And if I'm rounding to my nearest whole number, it is clearly closer to 12 than it is to 11. So it would be 12, right? I would round this to 12. Sometimes we're not trying to round to a whole number though. Sometimes we try to round to a particular decimal place. Like with money, we try to round to the nearest hundredth, which means I'm trying to make my number end here. And so I need to look to the right to the number behind it and think, is that large enough that this is closer to 6.79 or is it closer to 6.78? And since this is a 1 and it's so small, I think it's reasonable to say it's closer to 6 78 So that would be us rounding it to the nearest hundredth. And that leads us to your turn. So I want you to round 5 36 hundredths to the nearest tenth. So I just want it to be one number behind the decimal. So think about what that would be, including, reflecting on those rounding rules. And know that's one component of our essential question of how to compare, order, and round decimals that we'll be practicing more together in class.